I wanted to go back and make one point about republics. So I was trying to think of examples of these forms of government in the Bible. And I thought of two examples of representative republics on display, taking on governmental functions in the Bible. So turn to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. Now, as you remember, we talked through the different forms of government. So when we talked about a representative republic, how it was the authority flowing from the people up rather than authority flowing from God down. And I want to show you an example of where I think that leads to. So in Mark chapter 15, verse 1, it says, "And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus, and carried him away, and delivered him to Pilate." So now Pilate is part of the government of Rome, right? Rome was founded as a republic and is still somewhat working on that basis. He's now the governor out in a province. And Pilate asked him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he, answering, said unto him, "Thou sayest it." And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, "Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee." But Jesus yet answered nothing, so Pilate marveled. Now at that feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And so, well, I'll come back to that point in a minute. "And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them," meaning release someone unto them. "But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew the chief priests had delivered him for envy." So here's the first point I want you to see, that you have a governing official. He knew the reason why the chief priests had delivered Christ unto them. Pilate was not a stupid man. Okay, he was a smart guy. And he knew why Israel had delivered them unto them. It wasn't for a just reason that they delivered him to Pilate out of envy. But the chief priests moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. Notice now, the chief priests moving among the people to cause an insurrection, to cause an uproar, cause a protest. "And Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him, whom ye call the King of the Jews?" Now right there, isn't that something that's wrong? You have the governing authority asking the people what should be done for the punishment. Shouldn't it work the other way? Shouldn't there be an authority in place? God definitely has an authority in place that He's laid down, and He's given a criminal justice code in the Bible that tells you how you are to handle criminals, right? And in each specific case, you don't go to the people and say, "Hey, what do you guys want done?" "Oh, hey, you know what? Here's this murderer here. What should we do to him today? Should we cause him to pay restitution?" Well, you can't pay restitution on an infinite value of eternal life, right, of a soul. What should we do to him? And you let the people decide? No, that's not how you do it. So right there, you see the evil form of humanism coming into play, where man's going to decide. Verse 13, "And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why, what evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him." So Pilate's showing right there, what evil hath he done? Pilate knows that the man has done no evil. He's done nothing wrong. And Pilate knows this. And he's the one who's in the position of authority in the government. So if you know a man to be innocent and you're in position of authority in the government, what would you do? Verse 15, "And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified." Why did Pilate do what he did? Was it because he was a righteous ruler and a righteous governor of the land? No. He did it to pacify the people. And that is what you have when you're when you have a democracy or a republic in play where you have people, and that's who you're trying to pacify, right? So when you have politicians, let's make a practical example. You have politicians in this land. Do you think that those politicians do what they think is right? Or do you think they do what will get them elected and fatten their wallets and give them security, financial security through this life? Yeah. Yeah. So he knew that Christ had done no wrong. Look at Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27. We have a parallel passage here, and there's some additional information given that I'd like you to see. Matthew chapter 27, verse 24. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing. Well, wait a minute. Aren't you the ruler of the land? Aren't you the authority? Haven't we already talked about the divine institution that God has put in place, where you have rulers that are supposed to enact God's ordinances? And what's Pilate doing? He's not upholding that divine ordinance. He couldn't prevail anything against the people, so now he's going to look to pacify them, as we had already seen. But that rather a tumult was made. Okay, so now there's this, revolt among the people. He took water and washed his hands before the multitude, there's the majority, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. So you have a situation where you have an innocent man who's being convicted, not based on authority or the divine institution that God has put in place of government, but based upon a majority rule system where the people says, give us what we want. So I wanted to make two examples of that with how we see the different forms of government, okay? For the next one, turn to Numbers chapter 16. I think Tom made reference to this either Wednesday night or last Sunday. But I want to show you a form of a republic in practice. Numbers chapter 16. Look at verse number 1. We're going to read a few verses in this chapter. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan, and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. So we took the princes of the congregation. Now we're going to see what they do, but in a way this is representatives of the congregation, right, that are going to come before Moses. So this is like a representative republic that's going to come before Moses on behalf of the people. And they gathered, verse 3, and they gathered themselves together against Moses. Now who is God's man? God's man is Moses, right? And he put Moses in place in a position of authority. But the people didn't like that very much, and we're going to see what happens. And against Aaron, and said unto them, Ye take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy. Oh, Moses, you take too much upon yourself. Seeing that the whole congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. If you remember, I said when we went through the different forms of government and you get to a republic and a democracy, what happens? Every man becomes God. And then you become subject to your neighbor. This is what he's saying. Everybody's holy. You take too much upon yourself. And when Moses heard it, he fell upon his face. Moses knows this is an issue, right? He fell upon his face. And he spake unto Korah and unto all the company, saying, Even tomorrow the Lord will show who are his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near unto him, even him whom he hath chosen will he cause to come near unto him. This do, take your censers, Korah, and all his company. So tomorrow we're going to find out who is God's chosen. Is it your representative republic, or is it me, in the place of God, who the authority is flowing through unto the people as the judge of the people? So we're going to find this out. Tomorrow, he says, verse 12. And Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram and the sons of Eliab, which said, we will not come up. Is it a small thing that thou hast brought us up out of the land that floweth with milk and honey, to kill us in the wilderness, except thou make thyself altogether a prince over us? So now they're revolting against the authority of Moses. Do you see this? God has put Moses in the position of authority, and they're revolting against that authority that God has put into place. Verse 16, and Moses said unto Korah, be thou and all the company before the Lord, thou and they and Aaron tomorrow. So he says, bring your guys before the Lord. Tomorrow we'll find out who the Lord wants to put in place or keep in place. Verse 19, and Korah gathered all the congregation against them unto the door of the tabernacle. So here's the people. This is the majority, right? They're coming together. Against them unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the congregation. Look at verse 28. And Moses said, hereby ye shall know that the Lord hath sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of mine own mind. If these men die, the common death of all men, so that means if they die of an old age or something like that, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. But if the Lord make a new thing, and the earth open her mouth, and swallow them up, with all that appertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then ye shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, it didn't take long, did it? It wasn't something where you had to guess about it. So many times, I know I haven't got to it. Let's read it first. That the ground clave, I'm getting ahead of myself. That the ground clave asunder, that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them. For they said, lest the earth swallow us up also. And there came out a fire from the Lord and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. So here you find a representative republic in the Bible, and it didn't last very long. It got swallowed up whole, and God consumed them in fire. Another point you can see is, as soon as Moses got done speaking these things, it happened, right? Right then and right there. So many times people in today's society will speak on behalf of God. And they will say, this hurricane is a judgment of God, or this or that. But when God acted in the Bible, He left no doubt, right? These hurricanes are not, an act of God that you put on. Well, it happened in Louisiana so many years ago. What was it, Katrina? Because they were the worst sinners in America. Well, they conveniently missed the French Quarters, right, where the majority of the immorality is, and they hit the churches in the surrounding areas. If they wanted to hit the areas of immorality, you think it might move over to Nevada. It's not too much for a God to take a hurricane across a desert and wipe some people out. When God acts, there is no doubt about it, and you know who it is, and you know what He's doing. So when you hear these fanatical people who get on the radio, they say things because they like to, I don't know whether it's for attention or ignorance or for money, whatever it is, all of the above. When God acts, you know why. But the second thing that I wanted you to see is that when the people came to try and represent themselves because they thought that they were holy, did God approve of that? No, he didn't approve of somebody coming along and usurping His power structure, His authority structure. Look at verse 41. But on the morrow all the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, saying, Ye have killed the people of the Lord. They murmured against Moses. Like somehow Moses opened up the land and caused those people, those rebellious people, to be swallowed up and to be killed. And it came to pass when the congregation was gathered against Moses. The congregation is the majority there, right? Last week we talked about, is the majority good or is the majority wicked? That's the question we have up there. And remember we went through the verses that showed that the majority are wicked? The majority are in rebellion against God. It doesn't take a rocket science to look around in the world today and understand that the majority are not people who humble themselves before God and love Him. The majority are people who put themselves first, who love themselves more than their neighbor, who do not care about submitting themselves unto God. So when it came to pass when the congregation was gathered against Moses and against Aaron, that they looked toward the tabernacle of the congregation, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. So God showed that he, in fact, was behind Moses, and those two examples of representative republics in the Bible don't have a very good connotation to them. All right, so let's move on. So the point is, if the majority are wicked, then a democracy is guaranteed to be wicked. I made that point last time. But the point I also want to make is that you may think, well, you know, you're giving our country a hard time. It may not be wicked at the time that it's formed, but eventually it is guaranteed to be wicked, right? I'm thankful, as I said last time, I'm thankful for the godly heritage that this country has and the men who founded it and many of the principles that they founded it upon. But that doesn't mean that it's right to then be able to vote on God's principles. Just as I gave you the example last time about the Southern Baptist Convention, who they get together once a year, and they vote on things of morality, such as homosexuality and things like this. Is it a good idea that we get together and vote about these things? No, these things are not up for a vote. It's not based upon what the majority thinks or what they want to accept. And the point I made to you is that over time, they're going to approve of things that they should not approve of, that are wrong in God's words, because anytime you do that, over time, things will not work out the way that they should. So we've seen this repeated, demonstrated throughout history, including in the moral decline of America, as we started out with a rich heritage and with godly people. And you remember the quote that I gave you last time? John Adams. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. And that's the point where I was saying I agree that, yes, this is not going to work unless we have a Christian people who are upholding God's principles. But then over time, what's going to happen with that? The majority are not going to be Christian. All right. So the principle, go to Proverbs chapter 29. The principle that we'll see from the Scripture is that in the majority, in a democracy, the majority are made king, and the laws eventually are changed to permit everyone's wicked desires of their behavior. And well, you say, what about the opposite end of the spectrum? You know, there's no guarantee, there's no good form of government on earth apart from the Lord Jesus Christ. But turn to Proverbs chapter 29, and the one principle that we would see on the opposite end of the spectrum, like from a constitutional monarchy sense, is Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. That's the opposite side of the spectrum, right? If you have a leader who is dispensing authority throughout a nation, and that's coming from God. If you have someone who's righteous in power and he's extolling God's principles and upholding these things, then we would rejoice as a people underneath that. But then, as we talked, you're not guaranteed to have somebody who's righteous. If you have somebody who's wicked, then we're going to mourn, because the wickedness then is going to be spread. So, anyways, those are both sides of the structure. I spent more time, obviously, on the democracy side because I think too often our Christian leaders, they prop that up and say, God ordained that, or God was the one who inspired our founding fathers to set up this form of government. And I just couldn't disagree with them more. I don't think that God has inspired that form of human government. God has given us through His Word an authority structure. So which way, we've talked about nationalism and the ordinances, the institutions that God has put into place. Which way does the authority flow? We said that authority flows downhill, not uphill, right? That's important to understand, especially when you're trying to understand how should government work, because the way that the political correctness of our day has it is that the governing authority should be subject to the people. And where does that idea come from? And I submit to you that that's not in the Bible. It's not from the Bible. You've heard the phrase, Mather Byles said, which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or by 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? That was, I think, when America was revolting against the British government. But democracy in theory and in practice doesn't work because people want to throw off restraint. They want to throw off God's law. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. So in a democracy, all of these things become legalized. And you don't have to take my word for it, just look at our laws, right? When our country was founded, adultery was against the law. In some states, it's still on the books. But do they enforce it? No. Are you kidding me? How old school is that? We think progressively. We're forward thinkers. All right. It started with adultery, and then it moves into, murder, where now we can murder innocent human beings, and there's no penalty for it. Immorality, where now we can create the acts, men with men, the abomination for the Lord, and none of these things are deemed as being wrong. We've gone from the one spectrum where they were deemed to be wrong. Now they're a virtue. Now they're propped up. So, notice how each one of these, I missed that. Notice how each one of the four divine institutions has an authority, and notice which way it goes. So remember the four divine institutions? So first, we have an individual volition. It's the authority to make decisions. It's the authority. When I was thinking about it, I thought of it like this. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's the authority of the soul to make the decision between the flesh and the spirit. I'm faced with two decisions. Which one should I go? I can go this way or I can go that way. And it's the authority of the person to make a decision. In a marriage, it's the authority of the husband over the wife, which God has put in place for the man to rule the household. Not only in marriage, but then in a family, we have the authority of the parents over the children. And in nationalism, the authority of the rulers over the citizens. And there is power in each one of those institutions. There's an authority structure within each one of them. And then God, up at the top, the source from which all authority flows, is at the top of each one of these institutions. And in Romans 13, we're talking about the delegated authority involved in nationalism, that it's been delegated to the higher powers, that God has put in place that for those institutions and governmental authorities. But there's ways in which the authority can be perverted. Because if you know anything about man, anything good that God puts in place, man will pervert, right? So there's a couple of examples in which these things can be perverted. The first one is government decriminalizing crime. The government does not have the authority to overrule God's authority and decriminalize things that God says is a crime. When the government says you can kill the Jews, that is an invalid law. Even if humanly legitimized, it is still murder. Because when we went and we tried the Nazis in Nuremberg, in the courts, and they said we were following the law of the land, and they said I'm a soldier in a position under authority from a SS officer who then got his authority from the government, their defense was, I was following the authority structure and that this was legalized. But we had enough of a sense of right and wrong at that time when America went in and tried them in those courts that we found them guilty and we said, you cannot decriminalize crime. In my words, not theirs, obviously. Murder is always wrong. And you can't say that your government is going to legalize it and now it's acceptable. No. We tried them and we punished them for them. The second way that we can pervert authority is by kids taking authority from their parents. This is a big problem in our culture today, right? Where you have parents not being parents. Maybe they want to be their kids' friends. Or the simple fact that they're just overtaken by their kids, right? They get into a situation where their kid wants something, and how many times have you seen a tantrum being thrown, and then, we'll let our children run the way that we run our lives, right? But this is a situation where you can't In a family situation, you don't flip it where the parents have the authority and let the kids have authority and make the decisions and say, this is how we're going to run our family. Another way that you see it being perverted is the wife assuming authority over the husband. So, this might be a touchy one, huh? I hope. I've never shied away from getting people mad at me, so I'll line up as a punching bag in the back afterwards, and you guys can take your turns with me. But I think that Satan's plan is the exact opposite of God's plan, right? And when you look at people who are in rebellion against God, the ideas that they're espousing, if you're in lockstep with them, you might want to examine. You might want to examine the way you think. So what I mean by that is, if you watch any program in Hollywood, the chances are you will find this perversion on full display. All the way from movies for older people down to kids' shows, and you will find the lie in practice. Husbands are made subservient to their wives. The wives and children have authority over the men. Men are made out to be incompetent morons. God's truth is under attack from every direction and in ways that our families are not even aware of. People will watch that and they see it and they think it's funny, right? They get a kick out of it. The dad being a moron, not able to lead his family. And the wife steps up and, she's sharp as a tack and she gets everybody in order and everything's great, or even the children. But that is mocking what God has put into place. And I don't think that the Hollywood directors are smart enough to do that on purpose. I think that there's just something about the lie that seems right to them. Do you know, as a Christian, how you could be posed with a dilemma or something like that, and you just know one way is right? You may not be able to explain why, but there's just something inside of you based on what you know that, boy, this just seems right over here, and this just seems wrong. I think on the opposite side, it's the same way. Those who are in rebellion against God, you have these people, and you know what? I don't know why, but I think I'm just going to do it this way and show the wife to be in authority over the husband. So, in light of Romans 13, another way in which authority can be perverted is for individuals to not make themselves subject unto the higher powers, as God has instructed us to do. So this principle of submission to authority is not the popular philosophy of the day, but it's the path to harmony because it's God's way. And if we were to say we were responsible to obey only the reasonable laws, that would leave the question of subjection open to each man's interpretations, right? I'm not going to make myself subject to the government. I'm going to do what I think is right in these individual situations, and this would lead to anarchy. Without order, we would be left with chaos. Remember on the spectrum, when you get away from government, you're left over here on the far left side with anarchy, where every man does what was right in his own eyes. So, all authority flows from God. God has established the authority structure, and we should obey the authority when it is not in contradiction with God's principles. So, I just ask you to consider what the Bible has to say about the nature of man, how he's inherently wicked, and to consider from whom authority flows and how that authority should be distributed within the framework of the divine institutions when it comes to the functioning of government upon earth. And now what I want to do is, believe it or not, we're going to get out of Romans chapter 1, or verse 1 of Romans chapter 13. Probably not this week, but next week. But if you remember when we started, I said that there's a false understanding. When you read, let's go over to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And I said that there is a false understanding when it comes to that phrase in Christian circles today. And so I mentioned that, but I said I want to cover some framework, some groundwork before we come back to that and really deal with it. in power. So after seeing that there's a divinely established purpose and reason that we have nations and governments, we can now come back to this. Now that you know that God has put in place certain powers and certain authorities, I want you to see a few things. So we already said that the proper authority structure is God over nations, nations over citizens, a father and mother over their children, a husband over their wife, and then you get to the bottom, individuals and their volition. I'm trying to decide if we can, how much time do I have? A minute after the bell rings? Or am I supposed to stop? I don't know.